typical animistic belief. Masks and costumes were employed in traditional shamanism and other forms of animism to change the personality of the wearer to allow communication with the spirit world. Now, on the one hand, we smile at these ancient ideas, and yet I'm going to suggest before we're through that there is some serious dangers in these games. Now, immigrants to the United States, particularly among the Irish, introduced Halloween customs, and that became popular in the late 19th century. Traditional mischief-making on this occasion was eventually replaced by the familiar small children going from house to house, usually in costume, calling for trick-or-treat. Going from door to door to seek treats may trail back to this Druid practice of begging material for the great bonfires. And to make the bonfires, the concept, they had to solicit the materials. And also, this may also relate to the Catholic concept of purgatory and the custom in certain countries of begging for soul case regarding all that. Now, the trick part of trick-or-treats of Halloween appears to be derived from the idea that the ghosts or witches created mischief on the living if they did not provide the treats. It became very obvious to some of the people that had a sense of humor that this could all be camouflaged by playing practical jokes that could be then blamed on the ghosts or witches, if you will. So that obviously, you can fill in the blanks. Some other aspects of Halloween that are probably not as obvious. The predominance of fruits and nuts is typically associated with this particular holiday. 3 of the sacred fruits of the Celts were acorns, apples, and nuts. Hazelnuts particularly. Acorns were sacred, associated with the oak. In fact, the word druid means priest of the oak cult. And the hazelnut was also associated with one of their gods. In ancient Rome, by the way, cider at this time of year was drawn, and the Romans bobbed for apples. Dunking for apples became an aspect of romance divination for trying to discover your future mate. In Scotland, young people assembled for diverse games to ascertain which of them would marry during the year and in what order the marriages would occur. There's all kinds, I'll spare you a rundown of all the details, but there's all kinds of usually apple-related divination among young girls. They believed that if you did an apple a certain way in front of the mirror on that night, that a apparition of your future mate would appear behind you in the mirror, kind of thing. All these superstitions they're all sort of woven into October 31st, etc. I find it rather interesting that as you explore all these pagan traditions that surround this particular holiday, it fascinates me that since 1965, UNICEF, an agency of the United Nations, has adopted Halloween as an opportunity to collect money for the United Nations Children's Fund. I haven't seen it in some of my recent years, but I gather there are from time to time people go house to house instead of trick-or-treating. They'll be collecting money for UNICEF. Sounds like a very appropriate thing, but in my mind, it's unusually appropriate for this ungodly United Nations to exploit this pagan holiday. Somehow that seems very strangely appropriate. I might mention, by the way, in my recent trips to Europe, I was rather startled to discover a practice that seems to be widely promoted among the hotels. When I checked into one of the hotels, in fact this happened twice in 2 different countries on that same trip, I'd check into the hotel and my materials when I checked in pointed out that $1 will be added per day to my room bill as a voluntary contribution to the United Nations Children's Fund. I was free to indicate on checkout that I objected to that and they'd be glad to remove it. But it took an overt action on my part, which I did take, of course. I have no objection to children, but I've got gigantic objections to the United Nations or any government meddling in this area. But in any case, they gave you little cards and things. But the point is they have managed somehow to promote this idea that in the billing, they assume that unless you object, you volunteer to add $1 to your bill for this fund, which I found rather provocative. Now, as we proceed down this path of exploring this strange holiday, I can't resist pointing out the bizarre possibility that one of our planets is partly to blame for all of this, in a sense. As you study these ancient cultures, and not just the Celts, but virtually all the ancient cultures, you discover something very strange. They all worshipped the planet Mars. And we sort of take that for granted. We see it in the folklore that these cultures worshipped the hosts of heaven and so forth. The name for Mars in the Bible is Baal. It's one of the names, one of several names for the planet Mars. There's actually about 360 names in the Bible that allude in one way or another to the planet Mars. You look at that and you sort of shrug it off as ancient superstition, and yet you stop and realize that these cultures were terrified of the planet Mars. Mars became synonymous with war. We use that same term even today. We speak of the martial arts and so forth. It's in our vocabulary. Now, you and I think, would regard ourselves as a fairly sophisticated culture as far as space is concerned, as far as astronomy is concerned. And I would imagine there's not many of us in this room that could go outside and point to the planet Mars if our life depended on it. And yet these ancient cultures were terrified by the planet Mars. Why? Why would they care? And one possibility is that the planet Mars interfered in their lives. It turns out, as you start studying ancient calendars, you discover some strange things. You discover that all the ancient calendars, some 14 of them that I've been able to track down, all were built around 360-day years and 30-day months. And you say, well, that's a good approximation, except they all were that way for many centuries until about 701 BC. In 701 BC, a large number of them changed. They changed their calendar. The Romans added a few days. The Hebrews added a month on some very weird formula, roughly once every 3 years, but it's not that simple. But all the calendars yet mucked around. Rabbinical literature ponders, why did he pick that particular peculiar formula? What they don't explain, it's a mystery, is why did he have to change anything at all? Why did the Romans and the Chaldeans and the Israelis and others modify their calendar in 701 BC? Now, it turns out there are some theories about this that sound at first very strange. And that is that the discovery in more recent years, as we refine our understanding of orbits, especially with all the satellite technology in the recent decades, they recognize very quickly that orbits can resonate just like sound waves do with tuning forks, or just like radio waves do with a tuned radio circuit. That orbits themselves interact with each other and thus have a tendency towards resonance. And the speculation, it's speculation, is that the Earth was on a 360-day orbit, Mars was on a 720-day orbit. It was in a 2-to-1 resonance with planet Earth. It turns out in these models, Saturn and some of the other planets are also factors here. But to keep it simple for this discussion, they have modeled this theory, and just a theory, and it turns out that the model implies that Mars would have a near pass-by with the orbit of the Earth every 108 years at various times. Each time the near pass-by took place, there would be an energy transfer from one to the other that would adjust these things. And finally, in 701 BC, in one of these near pass-bys, the energy transfers were such as to stabilize them where they are today. The Earth has a 365.25 day, nominally, orbit, and Mars is now 687. And the energy transfers, the details are amazingly, they model with great precision. Now, what makes this provocative, one reason it comes up, is if their model is correct, it implies that Mars passed near the Earth on a predictable basis. The degree to which it would pass may not have been predicted. That requires a lot of precision. But the fact that every 108 years there was a possibility, if Saturn was in a particular 90-degree relationship in these orbits, then Mars would pass very, very closely. And it turns out, as you lay this all out, it coincides with a whole series of catastrophes in the ancient past, recorded in a variety of ways. Now, I won't take the time tonight to go through all that. We have published a briefing package called The Mysteries of the Planet Mars that attempts to go into this in more detail. Now, as you explore these things, we, of course, got interested in this partly because it impacts the possibilities that might surround the long day of Joshua, plus other issues. And so we've talked about this in the past. But as you explore this and begin to regard it as rather fanciful, it's rather interesting to discover that these theories, colorful though they are and embellished in very elegant mathematics, seem to be corroborated by a guy by the name of Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift was an Irish satirist. His intent was to write very bitter satire on the government in London. The Irish did not have a warm feeling for England.